Welcome to the Writer Reads Seventh Son, Part 3. Seppelitus was trying to work out what to make of that when it left, closing the door firmly behind it. He did not resist when the other garitzik closed in and drew his arms behind his back to bind them, but he made them lift him to his feet, which he found was more necessary than he realized. Two of the creatures took him from the chamber and further beneath the stronghold. Before the ogres, there is one thing more. Seppelitus heard the glee in the creature's voice and tried to guess what caused it. He tried also to note the corridors they passed, the twists, turns, and descents, but he couldn't. His mind felt battered, or as though someone had filled it with batter. His thoughts swam through a doughy morass. All the better for coming up with half-baked ideas, Seppelitus thought, and felt his lips shift into a humorless smile. "You think this funny?" his escort said, noting his expression. "You love what comes next." "Pretty sure I won't," Seppelitus said, but his reply was flat. "Sure you will." And the garitzik turned to follow a small corridor, whose entrance was flanked by pillars cut into the walls and twined with carvings of winged serpents and flowering foss vines. Seppelitus was almost certain those were something he should be concerned about. But serpents and foss had nothing to do with ogres. They were associated with something much, much worse, something that should fill his gut with fear. He racked his mind for the answer. Foss, the serpent vine, treacherous and beautiful. The serpents, winged, leathery wings, no feathers. Winged serpents, patterned with foss-shaped blotches. Elegant. He raised his head, trying to see if the walls were painted, but the first narrow stretch of stone was plain. It wasn't until the garitzik stepped out into the hall of ice-like marble that he realized. Of course, the otherworldly glow crystals were a dead giveaway. He stopped short, his gasp whispering out into the semi-dark. "So you brought him, then?" The voice was sharply female and bloated with such sensual promise that Seppelitus backpedaled, trying to resist the forward drag on his arms. It did him no good. The garitzik hauled him onward as though his struggles meant nothing. He tried to speak, but found his voice catching on a throat gone dry with terror. Seppelitus swallowed, moistening his throat enough for words. "Please." "Perhaps," the voice teased. "It depends on how busy we are with our latest toy." "And our Lord has forbidden he risk damage." The gargoyle's tone was censorious. Seppelitus could see her now, and she was every bit as beautiful as her voice promised, despite the pout on her pretty face. She also possessed a fine pair of black wings, striated with purple outlined in red, a serpentine tail that she flicked idly from side to side, and familiar features. Succubus, but he couldn't place her face before she spoke again. "Are you suggesting we would forget ourselves?" she asked, and Seppelitus was horrified to find himself wishing she would, even as he tried to run. "It has been known for others," the garitzik began, lifting its prisoner from the floor so Seppelitus's feet took him nowhere. "True, but you fulfilled this contract for us, and more will follow." The succubus stepped close enough to lay a palm gently against Seppelitus's cheek. "Be still," she said, capturing his gaze with her eyes. "Be still. You have nothing to fear." And Seppelitus felt his body obey, while his mind screamed in denial. The garitzik lowered him so that his feet touched the floor. "Come," it said, and the succubus giggled. I can't," Seppelitus protested and trembled in his captor's grasp. "I could fix that for you," the succubus quipped, playfully suggestive, as she led the way through a curtain dividing the hall into two sections. On the other side was a dining room, its large stone table set for six. Another succubus was already seated to the left of the table's head. Seppelitus looked at the guard on his right, the one who had given him the instruction. Please, he whispered, even as they stepped closer to the table. They cannot have you, the garitzik replied, but the gaze it turned on him was curious, though most of our prisoners beg for their touch. At first, added the guard on his other side. Now come. Please don't, Seppelitus repeated, even as he obeyed. The garitzik shook him, and he fell silent, hearing an echo of his whisper coming from behind one of the tapestried walls. Sit. Guided to the chair at the table's foot and a seat away from the succubus, Seppelitus did as he was told, regretting his obedience when his captors stood on either side, their hands resting on the back of his seat, their bodies blocking any chance of his leaving the table. The succubus who had brought them continued to the curtain at the end of the room. My lord, she called, we have guests. Is it time for dinner then? Seppelitus froze. He knew that voice. Why, yes, my lord, the succubus replied. Please come. Very well. And Seppelitus watched as an all too familiar figure brushed past the demoness to take his place, watching as Haskellane stopped halfway to the table. Seppelitus! And the young lord gave a bark of laughter, looking to the lead guard. So you caught him then? Of course, the garitzik replied, bowing his head. And do you consider our bargain fulfilled? Haskellane came the last few steps to the table and spread his arm to indicate the two succubi. Of course, he said, well worth the price. Haskellane caught the look on Seppelitus's face and mistook it for disgust. What? He asked. I heard the women of the abyss could make a man weep with passion. You were a small price to pay for ensuring the gargoyles could have access to the house. Not a sorcerer, then, Seppelitus thought. Not a treacherous family member, just the lust of a treacherous lordling. He wanted to say something, to protest, to scold the man for his callous stupidity, but he couldn't see the point. Haskellane would understand soon enough. The garitzik's reply to Haskellane reminded Seppelitus that the gargoyles of the ice were masters of barter. Then our business is concluded, is it not? Most satisfactorily so, Haskellane affirmed, and frowned as the garitzik looked to the succubus. And you? Ice, Captain, the succubus said, her voice a throaty purr as she draped her hands over Haskellane's shoulders. We are very satisfied. The garitzik stepped back and indicated Seppelitus should rise. Unless you'd like to stay? No, he said, scrambling so quickly to his feet he almost fell out of the chair. Haskellane gave another harsh laugh, but the succubus quirked an eyebrow. Are you sure, seventh son? She asked. Tomorrow's dusk will see you given to the ogres. We could make the intervening hours a pleasure. Seppelitus backed away from the table so fast he almost entangled himself in the curtains. Only the garitzik taking hold of his arms stopped him. Be still, one said. We will take you with us, but to this you must bear witness. Seppelitus wanted to protest that no, he really mustn't. But, as if his captors were a signal, two more succubi stepped out from behind the tapestries lining the room's walls. Seppelitus watched as Haskellane's frown turned to unease, saw the lordling look up at the succubus who was leaning on his shoulders and staring at Seppelitus. It was a pleasure doing business, she said, addressing the garitzik as the newly arrived succubi revealed the golden chains they'd brought. Haskellaine's unease turned to fear, and he struggled to rise. The succubus pinned him with her weight and drew her fingers down his cheek. They left fine lines of blood in their wake. Such a big man, she said. Isn't this what you wanted? I. Haskellane gulped, his eyes darting from one shapely form to another. But there are four of you. There was a flurry of movement as the succubi surged forward, and Haskellane was hidden from view. The lead succubus's reply carried clearly to where Seppelitus stood with his escort. "I'm sure you can manage, my lord." Another of the succubi looked over her shoulder at the garitzik and their prisoner. Her smile made Seppelitus want to beg for mercy. "Ice captain," she said, "our business is concluded." "Then we shall leave you in private." The succubus's smile turned coy. "You know there's no need for that," she said, her look inviting them closer. To Seppelitis it seemed as if the world blinked, and when it was back in focus, he was standing in a corridor he'd never seen, in the tight grip of his guards, in front of a plain stone door with a metal grill. "Thank you," he said, feeling his knees go weak with relief. They did not answer, but opened the door and walked him into the cell. There they secured a chain to each of his ankles and unbound his arms. "Best you should rest," the lead guard said. "Long journey tomorrow." Seppelitus thought about asking for food, but did not want to risk having to dine with Haskaline and the succubi. He watched the garitzik leave and stayed silent. When the door was locked and he was alone in the cell, Seppelitus closed his eyes and tried to do as they suggested. The toll of a long day of trying to keep Haskaline out of trouble, his capture, the interrogation, and his encounter with the succubi had left him more exhausted than he'd realized. He woke to the door rattling open. Up. Seppelitus stood slowly, wondering what landslide he'd been caught under and who had filled his mouth with dirty linen. A pile of cloth was thrust into his hands. On top of it was a flask. Dress and drink. Amongst other things, Seppelitus thought, setting the bundle to one side and using the filth-rimed bucket in one corner of the cell for what it was intended. It would have been nice if the garitzik had left the cell or turned their backs, but they didn't, and he hadn't the energy to argue. At least they were letting him dress.